I was born in Toccoa, which is also a Cherokee word for the beautiful. It's a small town, so you see everybody, especially from middle school through high school, almost every day.
Sean Scott grows up as a devout Southern Baptist in the small town in Georgia where his parents meet in 1973.
My mom got pregnant, and they got married out of a sense of obligation to their Christian faith. They got divorced, and my mom met Don the next summer. The gentleman that I call my dad, Don Scott, adopted me in 1981. And I always felt like he dearly loved me. Dad never made me feel any different from the rest of the Scott family.
Don marries Sean's mother, and 8 years later, Sean's half-brother Daniel is born.
When I was very little, Sean and I were very close. He was my childhood hero. Sean was this rock star. Everyone knew who he was, everyone liked him, everyone was always wanting to talk to him. He was on the football team. That was the #1 football team in the state for many years. I wanted to do nothing more than to be Sean.
As he nears his junior year, Sean starts thinking about his future. He has huge aspirations for college, but his mom is an artist, and his stepdad is retired from the Navy.
And both my mom and dad sat me down and said, look, son, we're concerned that if you're going to go to college, you're going to have to figure out how to finance it yourself because we don't have the means to help you. So I started looking for all the schools that had cheap tuition, and then I landed on the United States Military Academy at West Point, and tuition per semester was $0. I'm like, wow, that's going to be easy to afford.
But West Point is the most prestigious military academy in the country and extremely difficult to get into.
So I spent a lot of time from 10th grade on in the guidance counselor's office. That's how I came into Trish Ellis's circle of awareness.
Trish Ellis, a bookkeeper at the school inside the guidance department, is the wife of a prominent pharmacist in town and the mother of Wendy Ellis.
Wendy was very outgoing and friendly, smiling all the time. She was a cheerleader.
I do remember Trish Ellis, Wendy's mother, being very, very much supportive of Sean. I believe that she saw that that would be very promising for her daughter.
Trish stops me one day and says, hey, Sean, Wendy is struggling in algebra. Do you mind tutoring her? And we'll be happy to pay you. I'm like, I'll do that for free. I'll pay you to do that. Wendy pretended to be struggling to learn and not be able to understand. She would bat her eyes at me, which really excited me. I was just mesmerized by the radiant blue eyes that she had. I really enjoyed the interaction with Wendy.
During the last semester of his senior year, Sean notices that Wendy is absent from school.
I passed Trish's office and I said, hey, Trish, I haven't seen Wendy in school in like 2 weeks. Is she all right? And she says, oh, well, it's pretty sad, but she's in the hospital down near Atlanta for a eating disorder, bulimia and anorexia.
Sean decides to show support for Wendy and visits her.
When I came in, she looked pitiful. When she saw me, she just lit up. Her eyes got wide. She said, Sean, you came to see me. And that just got me right there. It's probably the initial seed that made me ask her to go with me to our senior prom.
Sean is delighted when Wendy recovers and agrees to go to the prom with him.
The night before my prom, I got home and there was all this paperwork laid out. There's a set of orders with my name on it, and there's instructions to coordinate travel to West Point. I was so relieved. The next afternoon, I picked up Wendy. We took pictures, and then we were off to dinner and then to the high school gymnasium.
The news of Sean's acceptance into West Point spreads throughout the dance.
Herb and Trish Ellis were chaperones, and they looked like they were overjoyed. Wendy said, "Oh, everyone is so proud of you, and I love you so much." You know, that night, I probably said I love you so that she would kiss me again.
Sean and Wendy grow closer, but once he's at West Point for his freshman year, Sean's schedule is regimented from sunup to sundown.
We were busy. Every time we went to the payphones for the privilege of a very brief phone call, my number one priority was to call Wendy. My second priority was to call my parents.
Wendy tells Sean she is still struggling with her eating disorder, but being in New York makes it hard for him to help her back home in Georgia.
When I was home on leave, Wendy asked me if I would go to one of her psych appointments. I was wholly and consciously aware that Wendy had long-term mental health challenges.
I believe that the protective nature of Sean would draw him to try to help someone like her. She's beautiful, she's well known, the family's well known. She has a problem, so naturally a protective person like that would want to try to shelter that person and help fix them.
At West Point, the years in the calendar seem to fly by, but every day seems like it's an eternity. So in order to help make the experience tolerable, there are a series of milestone events that include a speech, a ball, a dinner, and one of those is called 500th Night.
The event takes place during Sean's junior year, and Wendy's parents drive her from Georgia to New York to celebrate.
They allowed Wendy and I to have some private time alone. Wendy and I enjoyed a wonderful night, and I was really excited and proud to show off my girlfriend from my hometown. It was just like a night of joy and excitement.
With only one more year till Sean's graduation, the future looks bright if they can get a handle on Wendy's health issues.
One day, we were out shopping together, and she just fainted right there in the store. She refused to have an ambulance called. She said that she had diabetes. I had no clue she had diabetes.
Wendy Scott is a very manipulative woman, and she's very dangerous.
She craved attention and affection from others, and she went to any length to get that.
Now I don't know what to believe.
Sean Scott is at West Point when he finds out that his girlfriend Wendy has another serious health complaint.
When I found out that Wendy had diabetes, I was very concerned for her health. She told me that the insulin that she had, she did not get from a doctor. Her father got it from his pharmacy that he worked at and gave it to her. Only once did I actually see her inject herself with insulin. I loved her, and I wanted to be a support to her and to help her in any way that I can.
Sean seemed happy with Wendy, but there was always something. about her that made me feel uncomfortable. There was just always that little feeling in me that just made me feel unsure about her.
By Sean's third year at West Point, his relationship with Wendy has evolved. However, he suffers a devastating loss in his family in April 1996 when his stepdad becomes seriously ill.
I made it home on emergency leave from West Point just in time.
I remember Sean opening the door to the ICU in his uniform from West Point and running through the ICU to my father's side. And then I was taken out of the room, but I remember looking back and seeing Sean sitting there holding his hand.
I was holding his hand when he took his last breath. I held on to it until I felt, the warmth leave.
The next year, Sean's stepdad's absence is felt at his graduation from West Point. But Sean is able to celebrate with Wendy and family.
My mom, my brother, Herb, Trish, Wendy's grandparents came and attended. I was full of pride and exuberance. I had people in my hometown that were there. I was going to get to shake hands with the President of the United States. It was just a great day all around.
A few days later, Sean and Wendy drive from New York to Georgia to elope, without family present.
Wendy and I got married in a tiny little chapel on June 3rd, 1997. My best friend Joe was my best man, and he brought along his wife. Wendy was over the top. She acted as if she was about to faint. She did not focus on me. She had a hard time getting through her vows. So that part was kind of bizarre. We had made plans for a honeymoon, and we drove straight through the night to Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. Wendy was not interested in any physical intimacy, and she said that she was feeling physically ill, and that was a great disappointment. But to me, that was not as important as abiding by my vow to love, cherish, and care for her in sickness and in health. I was okay with that because there are higher priorities than my own carnal satisfaction.
A year later, in 1998, after taking the U.S. Army Engineer Officers course, Wendy and Sean moved to Columbia, Georgia, just a few hours from home.
My first permanent duty station in the Army was Fort Benning in Georgia. And we went and did fun things by ourselves and with other people, my West Point classmates included.
Later that year, Hurricane Mitch devastates Central America, and Sean is deployed as part of the Army Corps of Engineers. When Sean returns to Fort Benning, he finds Wendy in a health crisis.
Wendy had gotten a referral to an oncologist because there were some irregularities in her blood work. She told me, "Oh my God, Sean, what if I have cancer?" And then the oncologist broke the news to me that he felt, in his professional opinion, Wendy had leukemia. I couldn't believe it. It was just another shock. I never shaved my own head, but I helped her shave hers. I rarely cried. I definitely cried tears that dripped on her head while I was helping her shave it. She was so grateful, and we had intimate contact that we hadn't had in months or maybe even in years at that point.
Wendy tells Sean that she wants to do the treatments on her own so as not to distract him from his work.
She said, "I've found a specialist that can treat me right here at the hospital. You can just drop me off in the morning and then I'll find a ride home." While she was going to chemotherapy, there was less strange behavior and all the other antics faded away.
Wendy starts her treatment, and Sean believes that all is going well until one day he is summoned to a meeting with some other Army spouses at Fort Benning.
It was a historic home of a colonel, and Wendy was sitting there, and she looked up at me, had a very nervous look on her face, and was very fidgety. You could hear a pin drop. One of the spouses said, "We have discovered that Wendy does not really have cancer. She's been lying to us, and we've all been deeply hurt by this." I couldn't say anything. I was filled with rage.
Second Lieutenant Sean Scott has been told by a group of Army spouses that his wife Wendy is faking having cancer.
I was just devastated, embarrassed. I felt sick to my stomach. I couldn't say anything except thank you for bringing this to my attention. I am so sorry that this happened. I learned that one of the church community saw her at the hospital. She just walked around like a normal person, and she wasn't behaving like she would behave at church, where she would present as if she was deathly ill and unable to perform activities of daily living on her own and needed help.
But how did Wendy trick her oncologist into a leukemia diagnosis?
I was finally coming to grips with an escalating pattern of behavior. I believe Wendy figured out how to manipulate her body so that her blood work came back such that more than one medical provider was convinced that she had leukemia.
He had worked very hard to get to where he was, and he had a very promising career ahead of him. The situation that she put them in could very much damage his entire career.
I was committed to her because I considered marriage my bond with Wendy and with God. And I wasn't going to give up on that, and I was determined not to get a divorce. I decided that I was going to monitor and control her behavior as best I could.
For the next 2 years, Sean focuses on the demands of his career and spends less and less time with Wendy. In April of 2002, he is notified that Wendy is in the ER because of a complication related to her diabetes.
The physician on call was present. After the whole cancer thing, I knew from then on that she was faking. She found some new docs who didn't know her backstory. I said, "Look, doc, I respect what you do, and I just want you to know that I know without a shadow of a doubt that my wife does not have diabetes. Never has." He paused, looked at me in the eyes for a second and said, "Okay, would you like for me to put her on a 72-hour hold?" I came in and told her she was going to a psych ward, and she was livid. She was throwing objects at me. She was yelling at me.
And Wendy has one more bomb to drop.
A nurse came in and said, "We got your blood results." Wendy was pregnant.
On December 13th, 2002, Sean and Wendy's daughter is born with hydrocephalus, a condition that will require multiple surgeries.
When our daughter was born, Wendy's behaviors regarding her own health just disappeared. It was like magic. I found out that I was deploying. I was amped and energized and excited to exercise my leadership in the role of company commander.
Sean is deployed to Kuwait, but gets emergency medical leave to return to the U.S. in March 2004.
I was back in the States in Chapel Hill, North Carolina for the first of a series of brain surgeries for our daughter at a UNC medical center. My personal belief is that the hydrocephalus condition, which was diagnosed as Chiari malformation, was congenital. In 2004, my daughter began developing symptoms from vomiting to abnormal eating behavior to constant diarrhea.
Sean is now stationed at Fort Detrick, Maryland, so that the family can be close to Walter Reed Medical Center, where their daughter is a frequent visitor.
The doctors were unsure as to what exactly was wrong. They were pursuing the option of leukemia, and they were doing everything that they could to help her.
Over the next 3 years, Sean and Wendy pull closer together. Wendy is no longer faking health issues and gives birth to a son who is underweight but otherwise healthy. At Walter Reed, the doctors cannot determine the cause of Sean's daughter's ongoing symptoms.
My daughter underwent hundreds of diagnostic procedures. The spinal tap, that's an extremely painful procedure, and it was gut-wrenching, heartbreaking to be present and in the room with her.
In June of 2007, Sean gets a call from Wendy.
There's going to be a multidisciplinary team meeting. So all the specialists, along with the primary care manager, meet in a room with the parents, and one of the lead GI physicians laid a bombshell. There are levels of magnesium in your daughter's system that I cannot account for. So that tells me that either you pointing at me or you pointing at Wendy or both of you have been giving your daughter magnesium of some form. And Wendy confessed on the spot. I did it, and I looked at her in front of all these people. All I could say was, how could you?
The place that you have to be mentally to do something like that to an innocent little child, you would have to be evil.
Sean Scott's 4-year-old daughter has undergone dozens of medical procedures for various health issues since her birth. His wife Wendy has now admitted to poisoning her. The state takes custody of the Scott children.
Anger doesn't even come close. It's more like rage. I was shocked, stunned, sickened, saddened. I drove Wendy home, and she cried, and she blabbered on to me about how we still have to stick together as a family. And I just looked at her, and I was like, will you shut the f*** up? Or I was going to wreck the car and kill both of us.
In June 2007, I received a call from Fort Detrick advising me that they had just received a call from Walter Reed, and they believed they had a child abuse case. They advised that the mother of the child had been confronted by the doctor and actually admitted that she had been poisoning her child and that she was withdrawing blood from the child as well. I knew about Munchausen by proxy, what they call it today, fictitious disorder by proxy. And immediately it triggered into my mind that I may have one of those cases. In a Munchausen by proxy case, the person themselves is Munchausen. And they cause their own illnesses or injuries to gain attention. And normally it's when they can't get attention for themselves anymore that they move on to a child.
Agent Smith calls FBI headquarters to talk to a profiler.
I knew that I was going to have to approach this interview differently. The behavioral analysis profiler told me to make the interview completely about her, to not talk about her children and the things that she did to the child, but to talk about how it affected her and how it made her feel. Just focus the entire interview on Wendy. I walked in, the chaplain was there, and Wendy Scott was there. You're expecting a monster, but in fact, she actually looks like a little child herself. She comes across very innocent, very naive, someone that you want to protect. Wendy showed absolutely no remorse during the interview. I realized that I did in fact have a Munchausen by proxy case, that she was truly injuring her child to gain attention for herself. And so my goal at that point was to get as much evidence as I could. I was able to get consent from Wendy to search the house. The home that the Scotts lived in was in a very nice area. The house was very organized and clean. Similarly, so was the victim child's bedroom. It was a beautiful bedroom. It looked like she cared very deeply for this child by the way that the room was presented. I spoke to the team leader of our evidence response team that went directly to the kitchen trash can. And sure enough, on the top of the trash can was a large bottle of milk and magnesia. And I saw a red hazmat box, the type you find in a doctor's office where you put expended syringes in. And inside were 5 syringes with blood in them. I actually took the photo books to see if they told any type of story. I was able to see things such as the child had straight hair. And I saw that Wendy had taken pictures of this victim child when she was putting curlers in her hair. I later interviewed the doctors at Walter Reed. They all described her as looking like Shirley Temple, who had curly hair. She wanted her daughter to look adorable and all the doctors to fall in love with her, to be the cutest kid on the floor, if you will. Wendy would do the child's hair in advance the night before, and then she would do something to the child to induce the symptoms that resulted in her bringing the child to the hospital. So it showed premeditation. I did learn through my investigation that Wendy herself had feigned illness at a previous base. She claimed she had leukemia, she was in a wheelchair, she'd shaved her head. She even shaved her eyebrows, literally had everyone absolutely convinced that she had it. She figured out a way to cause those type of symptoms in herself, and she was trying to do the same thing to her daughter.
Sean must now prove he is a fit parent to regain custody of his children.
I had a court date immediately. I had to hire my own attorney.
It was really devastating to him. But he picked himself up and began to make sure the children had a stable, safe place to be.
The evidence, timing, and Sean's record of conduct eventually exonerate him from suspicion.
Sean Scott had been serving his country, only to find that the enemy was not abroad. The enemy was in his own household, nearly killing his child. When the victim and the younger sibling were in Sean Scott's custody, they immediately started improving. The symptoms that the child presented with at Walter Reed Medical Center never, ever recurred.
After convincing a judge that I was a fit parent, I got legal custody of my children.
The case goes from FBI jurisdiction during the investigation to Maryland state prosecutors as they prepare for an indictment.
Agent Smith reviewed with me the information she received from Dr. Delormier, the attending physician at Walter Reed Medical Center. This woman was causing her child a near-death medical condition. The symptoms progressed to dramatic blood loss to the point where on 3 different occasions that the child had to be transfused. Dr. Delormier testified that the child could very well have died with the amount of blood that was taken from her system. It was dangerous enough that as a prosecutor, I had to make sure that she never had contact with that child again, with her younger child, or with any child. That was my focus.
On November 16th, 2007, Wendy Scott is indicted on 15 charges.
She was charged with at least 2 counts of first-degree child abuse, second-degree child abuse, first-degree assault, second-degree assault, and reckless endangerment.
On March 13th, 2008, Wendy Scott pleads guilty to first-degree child abuse.
In exchange for dismissing the remaining counts, the defense agreed that at sentencing, the parties would be free to argue as to what the appropriate sentence would be.
Wendy's sentencing hearing takes place 2 months later.
When she first came into court, she was just fluttering around, smiling, talking to people. It was clear she wanted to be the center of attention. But she did not testify during the sentencing hearing. The state presented testimony principally from Dr. Delormier. He was so incensed by this whole incident and what that child had suffered. Because of the blood loss levels, the myriad of tests that she had had to undergo, the radiology she was subjected to, his testimony went to the permanency of the injury to that young victim. The defense, they were arguing that she didn't intend to hurt the child. The only reason she was doing it was because of her own mental disorder. She'd been diagnosed with a borderline personality disorder. One of the manifestations of that was the fictitious disorder and fictitious disorder by proxy. But she knew that the blood she was withdrawing was causing the child to be transfused at least 3 times. And for her to say that she didn't know that what she was doing was causing harm is just not defensible.
Concerned that Wendy will present a further risk to her daughter if she gets a light sentence, the prosecution presents surprising evidence that her disorder is deeply rooted. Even while on bail, Wendy had been exhibiting classic fictitious disorder behaviors.
She decided to get a job, and while she was there, I discovered that she was faking cancer and diabetes. She would go on her lunch break and sit in her car on a 90-plus degree day, and then passing out, and that the ambulance would be called. She submits a request to this employer requesting time off, saying that she had lymphoma and that she needed to go for chemo on a weekly basis.
She was engaging in this very type of behavior, even at a time where she was participating in counseling and under the supervision of a psychiatric professional. She was doing this again.
This revelation seals Wendy's fate with the judge.
The judge sentenced her to 15 years of active incarceration and 5 years of supervised probation.
I had finally come to the realization that she was never going to stop doing this.
Sean takes off his wedding ring, files for divorce, and visits Wendy in jail one last time.
Within a couple of seconds of visiting her, and she looked down and she held my hand and she said, "Why did you take off your ring? Someone will fall in love with you. You can't do that." So I was just like, "I'm sorry." And she's like, "I think you need to go."
After 11 years of trauma, Sean is free to find love with a new partner and discovers there is light at the end of the tunnel.
My brother and Sean worked together at Walter Reed. We were both going through divorces about the same time, and we were friends. I wanted to help Sean primarily because I knew what a wonderful man he was. As a mother, it's an overwhelming story to hear. It still hurts to this day. Yeah, I felt terrible for him because it was a lot. And as a mom, like, our kids are close in age, so it really hit home. Our friendship grew more and more. Once his divorce was final, it was like an instant connection. Sean's children needed a lot of healing and love and support due to the damage that was caused by Wendy Scott.
In 2010, Sean and Rachel marry and blend their families. Rachel becomes the loving and protective mother Sean's kids have never known.
While Sean was deployed to Afghanistan, Wendy submitted a request for reconsideration. She wanted to reduce her prison time. And we feel that she coordinated that request in knowing that Sean was in Afghanistan. And so I attended that request. It was probably the most terrifying day of my life because I really didn't want to see Wendy in person. But I was also proud to speak on the kid's behalf because he was obviously not able to be there.
For the first time since her arrest, Wendy takes the stand.
You start by telling him your name.
Wendy Michelle Scott.
You have any children?
Yes, I do.
She obviously presented a very positive picture of her accomplishments.
Do you currently believe you're a danger to the community?
No, I am not.
Not one mention was made about the child. She knew that her counseling would not be successful if she was not able to be honest. So I asked her, tell me what you did to your daughter.
Ms. Scott, could you tell us please what you did to...
And she was very taken aback by that. The defense, of course, objected to it, and the judge wanted to hear the answer too. She hemmed and she hawed.
Miss Angel, I am not a doctor. I cannot honestly, under oath, say that I know exactly what I did to her. I don't know.
And I don't think she ever really did answer my question. I just said, I have nothing more. I don't have any more questions.
And then I read a victim impact statement. She works hard every single day of her life to try to be a typical kid. She will be scarred forever. It is something that we will deal with for the rest of her life. And part of that was I had said that his daughter had her feeding tube removed. And as I was saying that, there was a cheer from Wendy, like, yay! Thank goodness I had the DA and the FBI agent on both sides of me because I think I would have done something mean. She did this to her daughter, and I'm the one that, along with Sean, we got rid of it and reached that milestone together. The damage and the harm that she did to an innocent little girl is just baffling. I think it's evil.
Ms. Scott, that sentence I imposed then is appropriate, and it remains appropriate. You nearly killed her, and your motion to modify is denied.
Wendy loses the appeal for a shortened sentence and serves her full term.
Sean and the kids are in a much better place. We all had to do the hard work together as a family. One of my proudest moments was to be by his side when he was promoted to lieutenant colonel because his career was almost destroyed because of Wendy. All 4 kids were at the ceremony, and of course, I cried. But it was just a very special day.
Sean is a proud and intensely private man, but he tells his story to warn others.
I'm at peace with it now. I'm okay. I cherish and appreciate the love and support that my wife and my children and my extended family and all my friends have given me to be able to get to the point. My purpose and mission will be to help somebody out there who's doubting themselves. Take action, don't hesitate, seek help. If you got doubts or questions, talk to somebody.
Sean is joyful in his new life and has high hopes for the future of his children.
They're strong, resilient children. I'm very proud of them. They're going to go on to do great things in their own right out there.
There is a profound and deeply unsettling intimacy to the American family home, a quiet sanctuary built on the foundational promise of safety and sanctuary from the chaotic world outside its walls. In the mid-20th century, this promise was the bedrock of suburban existence, a collective agreement that whatever happened behind closed front doors was a private matter, shielded by drawn curtains and neatly manicured lawns. But houses are also perfect vessels for secrets. They absorb the silence of strained relationships, they witness the slow deterioration of bonds, and occasionally, they become the silent accomplices to nightmares so incomprehensible that they shatter the very illusion of domestic tranquility. It is within this fragile construct of normalcy that one of the most chilling and meticulously executed crimes in the annals of American history unfolded. The year was 1965, a period marked by rapid cultural shifts and the steady hum of post-war prosperity, but in a quiet neighborhood in Houston, Texas, time had seemingly stopped, giving way to a localized, suffocating darkness that would leave an indelible stain on the city's collective memory. Houston in late June is a city defined by its oppressive atmosphere, a thick, unrelenting heat that settles over the streets and forces life into a sluggish, measured pace. It was under this sweltering Texas sun, on the 23rd of June, that the facade of a seemingly unremarkable residence on Driscoll Street was permanently torn away. The house at 1815 Driscoll Street was indistinguishable from countless others, a typical structure housing typical residents, or so it appeared to the outside world. Within its walls lived Fred and Edwina Rogers, an elderly couple navigating the twilight of their lives. Fred, at 81 years old, and Edwina, at 72, were of an age where vulnerability becomes a constant companion, a time when the world outside often shrinks to the dimensions of one's own property line. They were parents, a title that typically conjures images of familial warmth and generational continuity, yet the reality of their domestic life was an inverted reflection of these ideals. They were not alone in the house, yet the nature of their cohabitation was arguably more terrifying than absolute solitude. The catalyst for the unearthing of the horrors within 1815 Driscoll Street was an action born of ordinary, mundane concern. A relative, a nephew of the elderly couple, had grown increasingly anxious after several days of absolute silence. Phone calls went unanswered, and a heavy, unnatural quiet had descended upon the Rogers residence. The last assumed point of contact hovered vaguely around the 20th of June, a date carrying the poignant weight of Father's Day, adding a layer of tragic irony to the impending discovery. Driven by this growing unease, the nephew reached out to the Houston police, requesting a standard welfare check, a routine procedure that officers perform countless times, usually culminating in a benign explanation or, at worst, the natural passing of an elderly citizen. 2 Houston police officers were dispatched to the address, tasked with piercing the quiet exterior of the Driscoll Street home to ensure the well-being of its aging occupants. As the officers arrived at the property, there were no immediate outward signs of distress, no shattered windows or forced entry to suggest a violent intrusion. The exterior maintained its silent vigil, giving no hint of the unimaginable butchery that had recently concluded within. The officers approached the house, perhaps expecting to find a couple who had simply fallen ill or suffered a quiet medical emergency. The process of entering the home marked the transition from the bright, suffocating heat of a Houston afternoon into a stagnant, perfectly preserved environment of concealed terror. Once inside, the atmosphere of the house began to speak to a deeply fractured existence. To understand the sheer magnitude of the darkness within the home, one must first grasp the bizarre and deeply unsettling familial dynamic that governed it. Fred and Edwina Rogers shared this space with their 43-year-old son, Charles Rogers. However, the term sharing is a gross misrepresentation of their reality. Charles occupied the upper floor of the residence, living a life of profound, self-imposed isolation. The relationship between the aging parents and their adult son had deteriorated far beyond mere estrangement. It had crystallized into a chilling paradigm of absolute avoidance. There were no familial dinners, no casual conversations in the hallway, no shared moments of domestic life. Charles and his parents lived completely separate existences under the same roof. The only method of communication between the upper and lower floors was a deeply disturbing system of passing small, handwritten notes slipped quietly under a closed door. This detail alone paints a portrait of a home saturated with an almost unbearable psychological tension, a house divided not by walls, but by an impenetrable, toxic silence. As the officers moved methodically through the rooms on the ground floor, they were met with an eerie stillness. The house did not look like a crime scene. It lacked the chaotic disruption typical of a violent struggle. There were no overturned chairs, no visible blood spatters marring the walls or floors. In fact, the residence possessed an unnerving degree of cleanliness, a sanitized state that would soon reveal itself not as the result of careful housekeeping, but as the meticulous, calculating aftermath of a predator erasing their tracks. This was particularly evident in the bathroom, a space that presented an immaculate surface, smelling strongly of chemical cleaning agents. It was a space that had been scrubbed with an obsessive, desperate thoroughness, completely devoid of any biological trace, an unsettling perfection that instinctually triggers a sense of dread in an experienced investigator. Finding no immediate sign of Fred and Edwina in the living areas or bedrooms, the officers naturally gravitated toward the kitchen, the functional heart of any home. The kitchen appeared as orderly as the rest of the house, offering no visual warnings of the nightmare resting quietly within its boundaries. Standing in the center of the room was the family refrigerator, a standard appliance, entirely unremarkable in its design and purpose. In the context of a welfare check, looking into a refrigerator is a standard investigative step, a way to gauge the recent activity of the residents by checking the freshness of milk or the state of perishable goods. It was with this routine, investigative mindset that one of the officers reached out and grasped the handle of the appliance. The opening of the refrigerator door is the precise moment when the narrative of 1815 Driscoll Street irrevocably fractures, shifting instantly from a story of domestic isolation to one of unprecedented, staggering horror. The interior light illuminated the shelves, revealing an initial sight that seemed perfectly ordinary. Carefully arranged at the front of the shelves were standard trays of food, mundane items sitting quietly in the cold air. But this arrangement was not a display of groceries. It was a deliberate, calculating curtain, a temporary shield designed to delay the inevitable discovery of the true contents of the appliance. As the officers' gaze adjusted and they peered past the innocuous barrier of the food trays, the reality of the situation began to materialize with a slow, agonizing clarity. Hidden behind the facade of normalcy were the remains of Fred and Edwina Rogers. The elderly couple had not simply been murdered, they had been subjected to a process of absolute obliteration. Inside the chilling confines of the refrigerator, neatly stacked and meticulously organized, were hundreds of small, carefully wrapped pieces of human flesh and bone. The bodies of the mother and father had been systematically reduced to unrecognizable fragments, packed away with a cold, detached precision that defied all human comprehension. The sheer volume of the dismembered pieces and the method of their storage spoke volumes about the nature of the crime and the psychological state of the perpetrator. This was not a crime of sudden, blind passion, a frantic lashing out followed by a panicked retreat. This was an act of sustained, methodical butchery. The realization washing over the officers was twofold: the immediate, visceral shock of the visual horror before them, and the subsequent, terrifying understanding of the time effort, and chilling calmness required to execute such a task. The neatness of the packages, the washed state of the remains, and the orderly arrangement within the confined space of the family refrigerator pointed to a mind operating with absolute, sociopathic clarity. The officers standing in that quiet Houston kitchen had unwittingly uncovered a masterpiece of macabre efficiency. The complete lack of blood in the rest of the house, particularly the heavily sanitized bathroom, now took on a horrifying significance. It became dreadfully apparent that the pristine condition of the bathroom was the result of a grueling chemical purge, a successful attempt to wash away the massive amount of biological evidence that would inevitably accompany the dismemberment of 2 human adults. The perpetrator had utilized the bathroom as a slaughterhouse, meticulously draining the victims, dissecting them into hundreds of manageable pieces, flushing the internal organs away into the city's plumbing system, and then painstakingly scrubbing the environment with harsh bleach and chemicals until not a single microscopic drop of blood remained to tell the tale. This level of systematic destruction required more than just brute force or raw anger. It demanded a specific set of skills, an understanding of anatomy, and an unwavering, iron stomach. To take apart the human form at the joints, to process flesh and bone with such clinical detachment, is an act that separates the ordinary murderer from the truly anomalous predator. As the initial shock began to subside, replaced by the grim realities of securing a major crime scene, a singular, overarching question began to echo through the silent, sanitized halls of the house. Who possessed both the motive and the chilling capability to orchestrate this flawless nightmare? The answer seemed to hang heavy in the air, drifting down from the isolated, silent rooms of the upper floor. The victims were an elderly mother and father, discovered just days after a holiday meant to celebrate paternal bonds. The only other occupant of this deeply fractured household was the son, who communicated exclusively through notes slipped under doors. Charles Rogers was not a typical suspect, just as this was not a typical crime. He was not a known deviant or a raving lunatic. By all accounts, he was a man of formidable intellect, possessing an exceptionally high intelligence quotient. He was a veteran, a former pilot for the United States Navy who had served during the Second World War, a man trained in discipline and precision. Furthermore, he was a highly educated professional, a geophysicist who had spent years analyzing complex data for the Shell Oil Corporation, a man fluent in multiple languages and accustomed to moving through the world unseen and unchallenged. The discovery of the bodies in the icebox was merely the terrifying prologue to a mystery that would rapidly expand outward from the kitchen of 1815 Driscoll Street. The meticulous nature of the crime scene suggested that the perpetrator had carefully orchestrated their escape long before the first police officer ever knocked on the front door. Charles Rogers, the brilliant, reclusive son, the phantom who haunted the upper floor of his parents' home, had vanished without a trace, leaving behind a sanitized slaughterhouse, a refrigerator filled with neatly packaged horror, and a legacy of questions that would ultimately consume investigators for decades to come. The quiet suburban house had given up its darkest secret, but the architect of that nightmare had already dissolved into the ether, leaving behind a chilling testament to human depravity and initiating one of the most perplexing and enduring manhunts in the history of American true crime. To truly comprehend the grotesque tableau discovered within the confines of the kitchen at 1815 Driscoll Street, one must first look backward, peeling away the immediate horror of the crime scene to examine the deeply flawed human architecture that preceded it. A crime of this magnitude, characterized by such cold, methodical obliteration, does not occur in a vacuum. It is invariably the final, cataclysmic eruption of a pressure cooker that has been simmering for years, if not decades. The victims, Fred and Edwina Rogers, and the sole suspect, their son Charles, were bound together in a domestic tragedy that severely challenges our conventional understanding of familial love and obligation. The history of the Rogers family is a grim testament to the destructive power of prolonged emotional abuse and the devastating consequences of betrayal committed by those who are supposed to offer unconditional protection. At the time of their brutal demise, Fred Rogers was 81 years old, and his wife Edwina was 72. In the eyes of the casual observer, They were simply an elderly couple navigating the quiet, twilight years of their lives. Society is conditioned to view individuals of their advanced age through a lens of inherent vulnerability and harmlessness. They represent the archetype of the fragile elder, figures who typically evoke feelings of respect and a protective instinct from the younger generation. The exterior of their Houston home undoubtedly projected this comforting illusion of suburban innocence and peaceful retirement. However, the reality thriving beneath that mundane facade was a stark and disturbing contradiction. While they became the victims of an unimaginable physical butchery, the historical context of the family dynamic suggests that Fred and Edwina Rogers were far from innocent bystanders in the tragic narrative of their own home. They were the architects of a deeply toxic environment, having allegedly subjected their son to a relentless campaign of psychological torment that spanned decades. The most perplexing element of this grim domestic puzzle is the primary suspect himself, Charles Rogers. At 43 years of age, Charles defied every common stereotype associated with individuals who commit acts of gruesome domestic violence. He was not a high school dropout, nor was he a man prone to impulsive fits of uncontrolled rage. He did not possess a documented history of severe, uncontrollable mental illness that might easily explain a sudden psychotic break. On the contrary, Charles Rogers was a man of formidable, almost intimidating intellect. He possessed a verified, exceptionally high intelligence quotient, a brilliant mind capable of grasping highly complex, abstract concepts. His early life trajectory suggested a man destined for remarkable success, a stark contrast to the isolated phantom he would eventually become. During the tumultuous years of the Second World War, Charles served his country as a pilot in the United States Navy. The role of a naval aviator demands an extraordinary combination of physical coordination, psychological resilience, and the ability to maintain absolute, unwavering focus under the most extreme and life-threatening conditions. It requires a mind trained in discipline and precision, traits that would later cast a dark, chilling shadow over the methodical nature of the crime committed in his family home. Following his honorable military service, Charles did not squander his potential. He transitioned into the highly demanding and intellectually rigorous field of geophysics. He secured a prestigious position working as a geophysicist for the Shell Oil Corporation, a role that required deep analytical skills and an expert understanding of the Earth's hidden structures. Furthermore, he was a gifted linguist, fluent in several languages, a man who possessed the intellectual tools to navigate the broader world with ease and sophistication. Yet, despite this impressive resume and a mind capable of remarkable achievements, Charles Rogers found himself trapped in a squalid, voluntary confinement within his parents' house. The tragic paradox of his existence is profound. A man who had soared through the skies as a naval pilot and mapped the hidden depths of the Earth as a scientist was ultimately reduced to hiding in a dark, upstairs bedroom, utterly paralyzed by the toxic gravity of his own family. The central question that haunts this case is how a man of such extraordinary capability allowed his world to shrink to the dimensions of a single, isolated floor in a modest, suburban home. The answer lies in the deeply rooted, insidious nature of the abuse he allegedly suffered at the hands of the elderly couple residing below him. The data surrounding the family history points toward a prolonged pattern of severe abuse that began in Charles's early childhood. Emotional abuse inflicted by parents is a unique form of trauma, one that fundamentally rewires a child's understanding of trust, safety, and self-worth. It creates a psychological prison that is often far more difficult to escape than any physical barrier. For Charles, this childhood trauma was not a closed chapter. It was a continuous, evolving nightmare that followed him into adulthood. However, the most destructive weapon wielded by Fred and Edwina Rogers was not merely psychological manipulation, but a calculated and devastating form of financial betrayal. As Charles grew into adulthood and began to accumulate wealth through his successful career as a geophysicist, his parents allegedly saw him not as a son to be proud of, but as an asset to be ruthlessly exploited. Evidence suggests that Fred and Edwina engaged in a systemic campaign of financial theft against their own child. They utilized his pristine name and established credit to secure numerous loans, accumulating substantial debt under his identity. The betrayal reached its apex with the revelation that his parents had repeatedly forged his signature, successfully stealing his assets and legally binding him to their own financial manipulations. This financial abuse was a profound violation of trust. It transformed the parent-child relationship into a predatory dynamic. For Charles, a man of high intelligence who undoubtedly understood the mechanics of finance and the law, the realization that his own flesh and blood were actively destroying his future must have been a crushing psychological blow. The money itself was likely secondary to the profound sense of betrayal. His parents had weaponized his own identity against him, legally and financially suffocating him while simultaneously providing the roof over his head. This created a paralyzing double bind, a situation where the brilliant scientist was rendered completely powerless by the people who had brought him into the world. The manifestation of this unbearable tension was the bizarre and chilling living arrangement within 1815 Driscoll Street. The house was effectively partitioned into two hostile territories, separated by an invisible but impenetrable border of resentment and profound distrust. Charles claimed the upper floor as his sovereign domain, retreating into a state of absolute, self-imposed isolation. He completely withdrew from the societal interactions that define a normal life, choosing instead to live as a ghost haunting the margins of his own home. He severed all verbal communication with Fred and Edwina. The sound of spoken conversation, the most basic element of human connection, was entirely eradicated from their daily existence. Instead of speaking, the family communicated through a method so bizarre and devoid of human warmth that it borders on the surreal. When communication was absolutely necessary, usually regarding mundane logistical matters or the payment of household bills, Charles would write his thoughts on small slips of paper. He would then quietly slip these notes under the gap of a closed door, ensuring that he never had to look upon the faces of the people who were systematically destroying his life. Fred and Edwina would respond in kind, passing their own written replies back under the wooden barrier. This silent exchange of paper beneath a closed door is the defining image of the Rogers household. It is a visual representation of a relationship that had entirely decayed, stripped of all affection, empathy, and fundamental humanity. It highlights the profound cowardice of the parents and the agonizing, trapped state of the son. The silence in that house must have been deafening, a heavy, oppressive atmosphere saturated with unspoken rage, deep-seated paranoia, and the suffocating weight of mutual hatred. Every slipped note was a reminder of the fractured bond, a daily reinforcement of the toxic war being waged within the walls of their suburban fortress. It is within this suffocating context that we must view the horrific events that ultimately transpired in late June of 1965. The gruesome dismemberment of Fred and Edwina Rogers was not a random act of violence perpetrated by a wandering stranger. It was the horrific culmination of a lifetime of intimate betrayal and silent warfare. The meticulous, clinical nature of the cleanup, the absolute lack of biological evidence left behind, and the deliberate, calculated packaging of the remains all point toward a mind that had spent years marinating in resentment. The intelligence and discipline that had once served Charles in the military and the scientific community were ultimately perverted and redirected toward a singular, monstrous task. The brilliant mind became entirely consumed by the need to completely eradicate the sources of his lifelong torment, to dismantle the architects of his misery with the same cold, calculating efficiency with which they had allegedly dismantled his life and his future. The house on Driscoll Street was never a home. It was a carefully constructed trap, and the silence that governed it was merely the calm before a storm of unimaginable butchery. Sunday, June the 20th, 1965. The calendar marked the occasion as Father's Day. In households across Houston, Texas, and throughout the nation, this was a Sunday dedicated to familial gatherings, shared meals, and traditional expressions of gratitude toward patriarchal figures. The sweltering, oppressive summer heat outside forced families into the air-conditioned, intimate comfort of their living rooms, creating spaces of shared domestic warmth. But inside the two-story residence at 1815 Driscoll Street, the calendar date held a dark, twisted, and ultimately fatal irony. For Charles Rogers, the concept of Father's Day was allegedly not a celebration of paternal guidance or unconditional love, but rather a stark, unavoidable psychological trigger. It was a glaring reminder of the man who had purportedly engineered his lifelong emotional imprisonment and orchestrated his total financial ruin. The atmosphere within the home that weekend was likely indistinguishable from any other day, suffocatingly silent, heavy with the toxic weight of unspoken resentment, and neatly divided by the closed doors that separated the reclusive son upstairs from the elderly couple living below. Yet, beneath this familiar veneer of a long-standing domestic Cold War, an absolute breaking point had finally been reached. The exact catalyst remains lost to history, permanently swallowed by the silence of the house, but the highly methodical nature of what followed over the ensuing hours suggests that the violence was not a spontaneous, uncontrollable eruption of sudden anger. Instead, it was a carefully premeditated execution, transforming the quiet suburban home into a theater of unimaginable, intimate brutality. The violence commenced with Fred Rogers. At 81 years of age, the patriarch of the fractured family was physically frail and vulnerable, rendering him entirely incapable of defending himself against a determined, physically capable, and deeply motivated aggressor. The weapon chosen for his demise was a simple hammer, a common household tool instantly repurposed into an instrument of blunt, devastating trauma. The act of beating a human being to death with a hammer is an inherently intimate, visceral, and exhausting form of violence. It requires extreme physical proximity, continuous exertion, and a sustained, relentless fury to carry through to the end. Each violent strike against the elderly man can be viewed as a physical manifestation of decades of suppressed rage, a brutal and chaotic settling of a lifelong, agonizing ledger of alleged abuse and betrayal. The terrifying sounds of the assault, the sickening impact of heavy metal against fragile bone, the inevitable, desperate struggles of a dying man fighting for his last breaths, must have echoed horrifyingly through the normally silent, sanitized halls of the first floor. It was a chaotic, bloody, and profoundly personal method of murder, a stark and terrifying contrast to the sterile, calculated silence that typically governed the family's interactions. Fred Rogers, the man who had allegedly utilized his own son's name to forge financial documents and systematically steal his future, was violently erased from the world, bludgeoned into absolute stillness within the very walls where he had exercised his toxic authority for years. The subsequent execution of 72-year-old Edwina Rogers was starkly different in its methodology, though equally sudden and final. While her husband suffered a prolonged and brutally physical end, Edwina was dispatched with a terrifying, clinical efficiency. She was shot directly in the head. The sudden, concussive crack of the gunshot would have been a deafening, sharp anomaly in the quiet Houston neighborhood, yet it seemingly went unnoticed or unreported by the surrounding neighbors, muffled perhaps by the thick, humid summer air and the constant mechanical hum of window air conditioning units up and down the street. The deliberate use of a firearm in this instance suggests a clear desire for immediate, clinical termination rather than a physical struggle. There was no prolonged fight, no extended physical exertion required to end her life. With a single, decisive pull of a trigger, the mother who had purportedly participated in the systematic psychological abuse and financial ruin of her only child was dead, collapsing onto the floor of her own home. The sudden, heavy silence that fell over the house in the immediate aftermath of the gunshot must have been absolute and suffocating, thick with the metallic scent of fresh blood and the irreversible, staggering reality of the double parricide. Two bodies now lay motionless on the floor of the suburban home, marking the definitive and incredibly violent end of the Rogers family lineage. The murders themselves, as horrific and absolute as they were, constituted only the preliminary phase of the entire incident. In the immediate, quiet wake of the killings, the perpetrator faced an enormous and incredibly grim logistical challenge. A typical murderer, driven by blind rage or sudden panic, might have dropped the weapons and fled the scene immediately, leaving the chaotic, bloody aftermath for the authorities to inevitably discover. But the individual who stood over the lifeless bodies of Fred and Edwina Rogers was not operating under the influence of typical panic. This was a highly educated mind trained in scientific precision, a former military officer accustomed to executing complex, multi-step tasks under immense psychological pressure. Blind fear did not dictate the next steps. Instead, a chilling, sociopathic pragmatism took absolute control of the situation. The overarching goal was not simply to kill the parents, but to erase their physical existence completely, to sanitize the environment so thoroughly that the house itself would bear absolutely no witness to the slaughter that had just occurred. This ambitious objective required moving the heavy, lifeless bodies from the specific locations of their demise into a space suitable for the grotesque, unimaginable labor that lay ahead. The ground floor bathroom was deliberately selected as the primary staging area, instantly transforming a mundane place of daily domestic hygiene into a makeshift, clinical slaughterhouse. Once the bodies of Fred and Edwina were secured within the tiled confines of the bathroom, the true, agonizing horror of the icebox murders commenced in earnest. The perpetrator began the arduous, physically demanding, and deeply horrifying process of entirely dismembering the two corpses. This was absolutely not a frenzied, chaotic hacking or a crude mutilation. It was a slow, incredibly methodical deconstruction of the human form. The forensic data later indicated that the individual performing this unspeakable task possessed a highly disturbing level of anatomical and mechanical knowledge. They did not simply saw indiscriminately through dense bone and muscle. They skillfully and patiently separated the bodies at the major joints, navigating the complex architecture of ligaments and tendons with the cold precision of an experienced surgeon or a master butcher. The sheer physical stamina required to meticulously dismantle two adult human bodies is staggering. It demands many hours of sustained, grueling, and physically exhausting labor, intimately interacting with the gruesome reality of flesh, bone, and massive quantities of bodily fluids. To perform such a horrific task on any human being requires a profound psychological detachment, but to execute it upon the bodies of one's own mother and father defies all known boundaries of human comprehension and empathy. It speaks to a mind that had completely severed itself from the emotional weight of familial bonds, operating purely on a terrifying plane of cold, mechanical efficiency. As the bodies were systematically reduced to smaller, manageable pieces, the perpetrator faced the immediate, pressing problem of disposing of the internal organs and the massive volume of blood inherent in such a massive anatomical operation. The calculated solution was as deeply disturbing as it was pragmatically effective. The internal organs of the elderly couple were meticulously extracted from their torsos, carried to the bathroom toilet, and forcefully flushed away into the Houston municipal sewage system. Piece by piece, the vital biological components of Fred and Edwina Rogers were sent down the drain, physically merging with the subterranean waste of the city. This specific act of disposal represents the ultimate desecration of the deceased, a literal flushing away of their humanity and their physical existence. It heavily highlights the coldly calculated nature of the crime, utilizing the existing, mundane plumbing infrastructure of the suburban home to effectively vanish the most biologically hazardous and difficult-to-conceal elements of the corpses. The family bathroom, originally designed for cleansing and purification, was subjected to a continuous, horrific flow of blood and viscera, transforming the white porcelain fixtures into vital instruments of absolute concealment. Following the complete dismemberment and the successful disposal of the internal organs, the perpetrator transitioned to perhaps the most critical and time-consuming phase of the entire operation, the chemical erasure of the crime scene. The bathroom, which had just served as an active abattoir for several hours, was subjected to an intensive, obsessive, and exhaustive process of chemical sanitization. Powerful cleaning agents, heavily relying on harsh bleaches and strong ammonia-based solutions, were deployed with absolute, unwavering thoroughness. Every single ceramic tile, every line of grout, the interior of the bathtub, the porcelain sink, and the entire floor were scrubbed relentlessly until not a single microscopic trace of blood or human tissue remained visible to the naked eye. This was a monumental and deeply obsessive undertaking. Human blood is notoriously difficult to eradicate entirely. It naturally seeps into microscopic crevices, soaks into porous materials, and invariably leaves residual chemical traces that can typically be detected by experienced forensic investigators. Yet, the cleanup orchestrated at 1815 Driscoll Street was executed with such terrifying, clinical perfection that veteran detectives would later find the bathroom entirely immaculate, smelling only strongly of sterile, institutional cleaning supplies. The perpetrator successfully washed away the visual evidence of the butchery, leaving behind a deceptively pristine, shining environment that perfectly masked the unspeakable atrocities committed within that very room just hours prior. With the physical environment fully sanitized and the odors of death replaced by the sharp sting of bleach, the final act of this macabre theater involved the careful storage of the dismembered remains. The perpetrator systematically wrapped the hundreds of severed, washed pieces of flesh and bone, preparing them for their final resting place within the confines of the home. They were carried out of the pristine bathroom and into the kitchen, the traditional heart of any domestic space, and placed meticulously inside the family refrigerator. The wrapped pieces were stacked neatly and tightly, maximizing the confined vertical space of the appliance, organized with the exact same detached, mathematical precision that had characterized the entire bloody operation. To delay the inevitable discovery by anyone who might casually open the door, ordinary trays of household food and mundane groceries were carefully arranged at the very front of the shelves, creating a perfectly normal visual barrier that successfully hid the gruesome, unthinkable harvest resting just inches behind it in the cold dark. This specific juxtaposition, everyday household groceries intentionally shielding the butchered, packaged remains of a homeowner's, is perhaps the most enduring and profoundly chilling image of the entire case. It perfectly encapsulates the profound, psychopathic deception at the core of the crime, highlighting the killer's ability to seamlessly integrate unimaginable horror directly into the mundane fabric of ordinary suburban life. Once the heavy refrigerator door clicked shut, sealing the meticulously packaged nightmare in cold preservation, the perpetrator's gruesome work was finally complete. The house on Driscoll Street was quiet once again, appearing entirely undisturbed and perfectly normal to the outside world. There was no visible sign of a violent struggle, no lingering, metallic scent of death in the air, only the quiet, rhythmic hum of the kitchen appliance dutifully cooling its horrifying contents. Charles Rogers, the brilliant geophysicist, the disciplined naval aviator, and the isolated son who had allegedly endured a lifetime of psychological torture, walked out of his childhood home and stepped into the oppressive, suffocating Houston heat. He left behind a perfectly sanitized crime scene and a refrigerator packed tight with the shattered, unrecognizable remnants of his family. He vanished completely into the vast expanse of the world without leaving a single tangible clue to his destination or his state of mind, effectively closing the book on his former life and leaving the authorities to eventually uncover the meticulously crafted, perfectly executed horror he had left behind in the dark. The discovery of the refrigerated remains inside 1815 Driscoll Street did not merely launch a standard homicide investigation. It ignited a sprawling, deeply complex, and ultimately maddening pursuit that would define the professional lives of those tasked with untangling its web. When the Houston police officers finally confronted the contents of that refrigerator, the atmosphere of the house underwent a seismic shift from quiet suspicion to cold, hard reality. The investigators were not dealing with a simple crime of passion or a spontaneous act of violence. They were stepping into the aftermath of a meticulously curated horror, a scene that had been scrubbed of its history by someone who clearly understood the mechanics of forensic concealment. The initial, frantic efforts to secure the home were marked by a grim, professional disbelief. As they began to catalog the evidence, the detectives realized that their perpetrator had left behind almost nothing. There were no fingerprints that did not belong to the residence, no discarded tools, no notes left behind to explain the motive, and most importantly, no biological evidence that could be traced to an external party. The house had been wiped clean, turned into a sterile, empty vessel that held its secrets with terrifying rigidity. The first step in the investigation was to establish a timeline, and here, the detectives were met with their first significant obstacle, the absolute isolation of the Rogers family. Because Charles had lived in such a profound, self-imposed state of withdrawal, rarely interacting with the community and effectively functioning as a ghost within his own home, there were no neighbors or witnesses who could provide a reliable account of the days leading up to the 20th of June. The neighbors, when questioned, offered only the standard observations of suburban life: the sound of a lawnmower, the sight of a parked car, the unremarkable passage of time that they had assumed was occurring behind the drawn blinds of the Rogers residence. The lack of social noise meant that the police were working in a vacuum, with the only source of truth being the physical layout of the crime scene and the unsettling behavioral patterns that had defined the household. The investigators focused their attention on the bathroom, where the evidence of the cleanup was most concentrated. They employed the forensic techniques available in 1965, searching for any traces of blood that might have been hidden in the grout or behind the fixtures. Yet, despite their best efforts, the bathroom remained maddeningly clean. It became increasingly clear that the perpetrator had not just washed the area, they had scrubbed it with an understanding of chemical interactions, potentially using agents that were far more sophisticated than standard household cleaners. This level of preparation suggested that the murder was not a sudden impulse, but the execution of a plan that had been developing for a considerable amount of time. As the detectives dug deeper into the background of the residence, the figure of Charles Rogers began to emerge as the central, yet elusive, subject of their inquiry. The information they gathered was contradictory and deeply complex. On one hand, they found a man who was clearly a high-achieving intellectual, the naval pilot, the geophysicist, the linguist. On the other, they found a man who had been subjected to a lifetime of suffocating, toxic domestic pressure. The investigators spent countless hours reviewing the financial records that had been seized from the home, and it was here that the potential motive began to crystallize. The extent of the financial exploitation was staggering. The records provided a cold, arithmetic account of the elder Rogers's betrayal, the forged signatures, the loans taken out in Charles's name, the systematic erosion of his economic independence. For the detectives, this documentation was the key to the psychological profile of their suspect. It provided a clear, logical impetus for the crime, transforming the horrific nature of the murders into a calculated, albeit extreme, reaction to a lifetime of abuse. But understanding the why did nothing to help them with the where. Charles Rogers had vanished with an efficiency that mirrored his crime. The search for Charles Rogers became a multi-jurisdictional effort, involving local, state, and eventually federal agencies. The detectives attempted to trace his movements from the moment he walked out of the house. They checked transit records, contacted former colleagues at the Shell Oil Corporation, and interviewed anyone who had ever had even a passing connection to the family. Yet, Charles was nowhere to be found. It was as if he had simply dissolved into the air once the refrigerator door had been closed. The investigation led the police to analyze his professional life, hoping to find a link to his knowledge of chemistry or geography that could explain his ability to disappear so effectively. They examined his past as a geophysicist, speculating on whether he had used his expertise in environmental patterns or his contacts in the energy industry to facilitate his flight. However, every lead was a dead end. Every location he had frequented was checked, and every potential hideout was cleared. The detectives found themselves chasing a phantom, a man who possessed all the necessary skills to outmaneuver them at every turn. One of the most persistent and frustrating aspects of the investigation was the absolute silence of the suspect. Unlike many other crimes, where the perpetrator might leave a trail of digital footprints or emotional distress, Charles had lived his life in such a guarded manner that there was no record of his true feelings or his plans. He had left no manifesto, no confession, and no indication of what his next move might be. The investigators had to rely entirely on the physical artifacts of the house, which were, in their own way, a testament to his personality. The way he had organized the refrigerator, the way he had lived his life communicating only through notes, these were the only clues they had to his inner life. The forensic team spent weeks analyzing the remains, trying to determine the exact time of death and the specific tools that could have been used to achieve such precise, anatomical dismemberment. The fact that the organs were missing, flushed away into the city's plumbing, meant that a crucial part of the forensic investigation was lost forever. The police had to reconstruct the crime using only the remnants, a process that was both physically exhausting and psychologically draining. As the weeks turned into months, the investigation into the icebox murders began to shift from an active pursuit of a suspect to a long-term, cold case inquiry. The detectives, once hopeful that a breakthrough would reveal the location of Charles, slowly began to realize that they were dealing with a level of professional evasion that they had rarely encountered. They explored various theories, from the idea that he had assumed a new identity and relocated within the United States, to the possibility that he had escaped to a foreign country where his skills would be in demand and his past would be unknown. The international aspect of the search was particularly challenging for the Houston police, as they lacked the resources to track a man across borders. They relied on information from informants, hearsay, and the occasional, unverified report of a man fitting Charles's description appearing in places as far-flung as Central and South America. Yet, every single report proved to be a false hope. The investigation also required the detectives to navigate the complicated legal and societal questions surrounding the case. They had to deal with the public fascination with the murders, which only intensified as the story of the refrigerated remains made headlines across the nation. The press was relentless, demanding answers and speculating on the darkest possibilities. The detectives were under constant pressure to provide updates, to explain how a man could commit such a heinous act and then simply disappear without a trace. They had to balance this public scrutiny with the need to protect the integrity of their investigation. It was a delicate, often impossible, position to be in. They had to treat the crime scene with the seriousness it deserved, while also trying to make sense of a narrative that seemed more like something out of a psychological thriller than a real-life homicide investigation. The investigative process, in its entirety, was a testament to the limitations of forensic science and the resilience of a determined individual. The detectives had all the tools at their disposal: the crime lab, the expert witnesses, the vast archives of the department, and yet they were consistently outplayed. The investigation eventually ground to a halt, not because of a lack of effort, but because of a lack of evidence. The phantom on Driscoll Street had left behind a perfectly executed masterpiece of disappearance. The detectives were left to wrestle with the reality that they might never find the person responsible for the horrors they had witnessed in that kitchen. They had become intimately familiar with the lives of Fred, Edwina, and Charles Rogers, reconstructing their history in order to solve their future, only to find that the future had been carefully planned to evade them entirely. The file on the icebox murders, thick with notes, reports, and photos of the immaculate, terrifying kitchen, remained open, a constant, nagging reminder of the one who got away. The investigation had become a permanent part of the department's lore, a standard by which all other cases were measured and found wanting. The silence that had once filled the house on Driscoll Street had migrated into the halls of the police department, a profound, unshakable absence that could never be filled. The formal resolution of the tragedy at 1815 Driscoll Street did not take place in a courtroom filled with lawyers, spectators, and the dramatic revelation of evidence. Instead, it occurred in the quiet, sterile, and largely invisible administrative offices of the Texas judicial system. Because the primary suspect, Charles Rogers, had vanished without a trace into the vast, unforgiving landscape of the mid-60s, the American justice system faced a profound procedural wall. A trial requires a defendant. It requires a person to sit in the dock, to be confronted by the evidence, and to be held accountable for their actions. Without Charles, there could be no prosecution, no cross-examination, and no final verdict delivered by a jury of his peers. The wheels of justice, designed to move with methodical precision, ground to a halt against the void of his absence. The absence of a body for the suspect and the total lack of any confirmed sightings for a full decade created a legal deadlock that could not be sustained indefinitely. In the years following the gruesome discovery of his parents' remains, the state of Texas remained in a state of suspended animation regarding the case. While investigators continued to receive sporadic, unverified reports of men fitting Charles's description, often thousands of miles away from Houston, None of these leads yielded the necessary concrete evidence to secure an arrest or even a definitive location. The police department, once consumed by the frantic energy of the manhunt, eventually had to accept the grim reality that their suspect had achieved something that few criminals ever manage: the total erasure of his identity and his physical person from the reach of the law. The legal mechanism used to address this stalemate was the declaration of death in absentia. In 1975, a decade after the nightmare had been brought to light, the courts of Texas finally acknowledged what the investigators had long suspected but could not prove: that Charles Rogers was effectively a ghost, a man who had ceased to exist within the fabric of American society. This legal procedure is typically reserved for cases where individuals disappear under circumstances that strongly suggest death, shipwrecks, catastrophic accidents, or long-term missing persons cases where the probability of survival is statistically non-existent. However, for Charles, it served a different purpose. It was an administrative closure of a case that had become an open wound in the city's criminal record. By declaring him dead in the eyes of the law, the state effectively ended the official pursuit. This was not a victory for justice. It was an admission of the law's limitation when confronted with an adversary who possesses the discipline, intelligence, and resources to completely detach from their former life. The hearing was remarkably brief, a stark contrast to the years of intense, agonizing investigation that had preceded it. There were no emotional testimonies from survivors, no dramatic confrontations between the prosecution and the defense. It was a cold, procedural necessity, an effort to bring an end to the administrative burden of an unsolved, high-profile case. With the stroke of a judge's pen, the files were moved from the active, open case drawers into the long, dark archives of unsolved mysteries. The absence of a trial meant that the public was robbed of the catharsis that typically follows such a crime. The questions that haunted the investigators, the precise sequence of events on that Father's Day, the specific psychological triggers that finally pushed Charles to commit such an act, and the exact methods he used to scrub the crime scene to such a level of clinical perfection, remained unanswered. The lack of a courtroom process meant that the narrative of the icebox murders was never subjected to the rigorous, adversarial testing of evidence that might have provided clarity. Instead, the story remained a collection of forensic reports, grainy crime scene photographs, and speculative theories that filled the vacuum left by the missing suspect. The impact of this lack of closure on the surviving members of the extended family and the community at large was profound. For the nephew who had first requested the welfare check, the legal declaration offered little, if any, peace. The horror of what he had unwittingly uncovered did not fade simply because the suspect was legally pronounced dead. The finality of the court's decision was a bureaucratic one, not a human one. It was a sterile, impersonal end to an event that was defined by its deeply intimate and horrific nature. The legal system, designed to provide a sense of order to the chaos of crime, could only offer a formal acknowledgement of the void. Furthermore, the declaration of death in absentia raised its own set of lingering, uncomfortable questions. If Charles had truly died, as the court suggested, where and how? Did he die alone, in a foreign land, haunted by the atrocities he had committed in that Houston kitchen, or did he manage to build a new life for himself, forever hiding in the shadows, waiting for a knock on the door that would never come? The legal conclusion provided no answers to these inquiries. It simply closed the file so that the authorities could stop looking. It was a pragmatic decision that prioritized administrative efficiency over the search for truth, a reality that only deepened the mystery surrounding the man who had vanished. Throughout this process, the role of the Houston Police Department remained characterized by a mixture of lingering frustration and professional acceptance. The detectives who had spent years chasing the shadow of Charles Rogers knew that they had been outmatched. The legal end of the case was not a vindication of their work. It was a testament to the sophistication of the perpetrator. They had documented every aspect of the horror they had uncovered, from the meticulously packed remains to the bleach-stained bathroom, yet their detailed work led to no handcuffs and no final scene in a courtroom. The declaration of death was the final, stinging reminder of the case that had slipped through their fingers. In the years following the 1975 ruling, the story of the icebox murders took on a life of its own. far removed from the legal proceedings that had ostensibly settled the matter. It became a piece of dark, urban folklore, a cautionary tale about the dangers of extreme domestic isolation and the potential for violence that lies hidden within the most mundane-seeming houses. The courtroom, which had never seen the suspect, became a theoretical space where historians, crime enthusiasts, and investigators debated the possibilities of his escape. Was he truly gone, or had he simply moved on to a different life, one that he had prepared for with the same clinical, long-term planning that he had brought to the kitchen on Driscoll Street? The law had spoken, but the questions remained, echoing in the halls of the courthouse and the memory of the city. The lack of a trial meant that the evidence gathered by the police never had to be weighed against a defense that could challenge its admissibility or its interpretation. The narrative remained, for all intents and purposes, a one-sided account provided by the prosecution. This absence of challenge added to the mythos of the case, allowing the horror of the event to grow without being checked by the realities of a legal process. The mystery of Charles Rogers became larger than the reality of the crime, a psychological enigma that challenged the boundaries of our understanding of human nature. The legal resolution was, in effect, a surrender, an acknowledgement that in the face of such a carefully planned disappearance, the machinery of justice was essentially helpless. As the decades have passed, the legal declaration has become the only anchor for a case that is otherwise adrift in speculation. The files in the courthouse basement are a record of a tragedy that was never allowed to resolve itself through the standard channels of retribution and sentencing. The lack of a trial meant that the Rogers family's final chapter was not written by a judge or a jury, but by the perpetrator himself, who, by disappearing, ensured that his story would never be told in his own words. The legal process was a witness to its own impotence, a necessary but ultimately empty formality that reflected the cold, calculated efficiency of the crime itself. The shadow of the icebox murders remains, unpunished and unresolved, a permanent scar on the history of Houston, shielded by the anonymity that the suspect worked so hard to secure. The final result was not justice, but a state of perpetual uncertainty, a haunting reminder that some secrets are so profound that they remain beyond the reach of the law, forever preserved in the dark, cold corners of the past. The echo of the tragedy at 1815 Driscoll Street has traveled far beyond the confines of the Houston courtroom and the sterile archives where the case file now resides. Decades have withered into history, yet the icebox murders remain a haunting, persistent presence, a dark anomaly that continues to challenge our understanding of the human capacity for calculated violence and the terrifying potential for a human being to simply erase their own existence. The physical structure that housed the horror, the modest, unassuming residence, was long ago demolished, clearing the land as if to exorcise the memory of what occurred within its walls. Yet, the absence of the building has done nothing to quell the persistent, gnawing curiosity that defines this case. It stands as an enduring testament to the fact that some enigmas are not meant to be solved. They are designed, with chilling precision, to remain perpetually in the shadows, defying the reach of time and the relentless pursuit of truth. The primary legacy of this case is the fundamental distortion of the domestic sphere. A home is universally imagined as a sanctuary, a place of safety where the complexities of the outside world are held at bay. The Rogers family, however, turned their home into a fortress of silence and a chamber of horrors. Their story forces us to reconsider the sanctity of the family unit, reminding us that behind the most mundane facades can exist an atmosphere of profound, toxic resentment capable of producing unimaginable violence. We are left to grapple with the disturbing realization that the most dangerous threats to our safety are often not the strangers lurking in the dark, but the people living under our own roofs, those with whom we share the most intimate details of our daily lives. The silence that governed the household, the notes passed under doors, the deliberate, aggressive avoidance of human connection, serves as a grim, cautionary illustration of what happens when the bonds of family are completely severed and replaced by deep-seated, systemic hostility. Furthermore, the disappearance of Charles Rogers serves as a sobering reminder of the limitations of modern investigation. In an era increasingly defined by surveillance, digital footprints, and the relentless tracking of human movement, the story of a man who could vanish so thoroughly in the 1960s feels almost impossible. It challenges our belief in the efficacy of the law and our assumption that all criminals will eventually leave a trail. Charles Rogers was not a master criminal in the traditional, sensationalist sense. He was a man of high intellect and discipline who understood that the greatest obstacle to his freedom was not the police, but his own presence in society. By stripping away every tie, every expectation, and every trace of his former life, he achieved a level of anonymity that rendered the combined investigative power of local and federal agencies effectively powerless. His success as a phantom is a dark, uncomfortable mirror held up to our own reliance on identity and social connection. The lingering questions regarding his fate are perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the entire affair. Did he truly perish in a remote corner of Central America, a casualty of the same violent, unforgiving world he had spent his life trying to navigate? Or did he continue to exist, perhaps adopting a new name, working in a new field, and living a life that was as compartmentalized and efficient as the one he had destroyed in Houston? The possibility that he could have successfully integrated himself into a new society, living out his remaining years while the authorities searched for a ghost, is a thought that haunts the very core of our desire for justice. It suggests that there is no cosmic balance to the scales, no guarantee that the perpetrator of such a heinous act will be made to answer for their crimes. The silence that swallowed Charles Rogers is the ultimate, final act of control, a refusal to grant the world the closure it so desperately demands. The analytical reflection on this case also inevitably touches upon the failure of empathy. How does a son reach a point where the dismemberment of his own parents is not only considered but executed with such cold, clinical detachment? The answer, as explored through the history of the Rogers family, lies in the slow, agonizing erosion of empathy itself. When abuse becomes the foundation of a relationship, when every interaction is defined by manipulation, betrayal, and the stripping away of one's dignity, the capacity for human connection can atrophy and die. The icebox murders were not merely an act of murder. They were a total, violent rejection of the very concept of family. They demonstrate the horrific speed at which a human being can be reduced to an object, a collection of biological materials to be processed and discarded, once the psychological barrier of empathy has been dismantled by years of torment. We must also confront the unsettling reality that the brilliance of Charles Rogers, his intelligence, his training, his technical expertise, was not a barrier to his criminality, but the very mechanism that enabled it. We are conditioned to believe that education and high intellect are safeguards against such behavior, that sophistication and success correlate with morality. This case shatters that myth. It shows us that a sharp, analytical mind can be just as easily turned toward the total destruction of another person as it can be toward the betterment of society. The precision of the cleanup, the tactical use of chemical agents, the methodical organization of the remains, these were not the actions of a deranged, disorganized mind. They were the application of science, discipline, and intelligence to the service of a monstrous objective. It forces us to look closer at the people who occupy the intellectual fringes of our world, reminding us that capability is neutral and that it is the heart, not the mind, that dictates the use to which it is put. As time moves forward, the memory of Fred and Edwina Rogers has become secondary to the enigma of their son. They are now merely the victims of an unsolved mystery, their identities forever tethered to the horrific manner in which they were discovered. There is a profound, lingering sadness in this fact. They are no longer people with lives, histories, and memories. They are the cautionary tale, the gruesome subjects of a case that has become a legend of true crime. The legal resolution of 1975 did not honor their lives. It merely acknowledged their deaths as a concluded matter of administration. The true tragedy is that their memory has been eclipsed by the dark, enduring shadow of the perpetrator, who continues to exist in the public consciousness as an impossible, unsolvable puzzle. In conclusion, the legacy of the icebox murders is a void. It is a space where answers should be, but are not. It reminds us that our search for order, for justice, and for understanding is often thwarted by the sheer, chaotic complexity of human behavior. We seek to wrap the stories of the past in neat, digestible packages, much like the perpetrator sought to wrap the remains of his parents, hoping that if we simply look at them enough, they will finally make sense. But the reality of 1815 Driscoll Street remains fractured and incomplete. It stands as a dark, cautionary monument to the fragility of our domestic lives and the terrifying depth of the human capacity for disconnection. We are left only with the silence, a silence that, like the one that defined the Rogers household, is absolute, unbreakable, and profoundly, deeply unsettling. It is a reminder that in the grand, complicated tapestry of human history, some threads are severed so completely that they can never be rewoven, and some truths are buried so deep that they will remain hidden in the cold, dark, and eternally quiet corners of the past, waiting for a light that will never come to find them. The mystery does not require a resolution to be real, nor does it require a name to be terrifying. It simply exists, a dark and permanent stain on the record of our collective memory, daring us to look into the void and see the reflection of our own fragility staring back. The investigation ends. The files are closed, the house is gone, but the echo remains, a steady, rhythmic pulse in the history of crime that will continue to resonate long after the last person who remembers the events has faded away. The true horror of the icebox murders is not just the act itself, but the completeness of its silence, and silence that speaks louder than any testimony, a silence that serves as the final, untouchable legacy of a family that was destroyed from the inside out, leaving behind nothing but questions that no one, regardless of their intelligence or their determination, will ever truly be able to answer. The investigation into the icebox murders, while legally concluded by the declaration of death in absentia, remains an active, pulsing nerve in the study of criminal psychology and the history of unresolved American crimes. To look back at the case of Charles Rogers is not merely to recount the details of a gruesome discovery, it is to explore the limits of our collective comprehension. When we analyze the final echoes of this event, we are forced to confront the fact that the most enduring mysteries are those that provide no solace, no retribution, and no ultimate truth. The case of the Driscoll Street house serves as a permanent, haunting reminder that the machinery of justice, for all its sophistication and its relentless pursuit of accountability, is not omnipotent. It is fundamentally fragile, easily outmaneuvered by an individual who chooses to exist outside the bounds of social expectation and who possesses the cold, calculated discipline to ensure that their actions remain forever unpunished. The legacy of this case is not the horror of the dismemberment, though that imagery is indelible, but the profound, unsettling silence that followed, a silence that has successfully resisted every attempt at penetration for over 6 decades. As we contemplate the enduring nature of this mystery, we must acknowledge that our fascination with it stems from a primal, deep-seated human need for resolution. We want to know the why and the how because we believe that understanding the motive or the method will somehow mitigate the sheer scale of the terror. We seek to wrap the narrative in the neat packaging of a psychological profile, hoping that if we can label Charles Rogers as a specific type of sociopath or as a victim of a specific type of trauma, we will somehow be safer, or at least better protected from the possibility of such horror in our own lives. Yet, the story of the Rogers family denies us this comfort. It refuses to adhere to the standard arcs of crime and punishment. It remains, in the annals of true crime, an anomalous, jagged piece of reality that simply will not fit into our preconceived notions of how the world should work. The perpetrator did not act out of a manic, uncontrolled explosion of madness that would lead to a trail of mistakes. He acted with the precision of a technician, a man who viewed his family as a set of problems to be solved and the domestic space as a site of logical, efficient execution. The persistence of the icebox murders in the cultural consciousness of Houston and beyond suggests that there is something about this crime that resonates with our deepest fears. It is not just the brutality of the act, it is the realization that the perpetrator was, for all intents and purposes, a functional, highly intelligent, and capable member of society. He was not the outcast living in the fringes of the woods. He was the man working for a major corporation, the veteran who had served his country, the neighbor who kept his blinds drawn. He lived a life of total, voluntary separation, and in doing so, he created a barrier between himself and the rest of the world that proved to be impenetrable. This ability to navigate the world while simultaneously harboring such a profound, dark interior existence is a source of continuous, chilling contemplation. It forces us to wonder how many other people might be living among us, harboring their own meticulously crafted secrets, waiting for the moments when they decide to reveal the darkness they have carefully, patiently cultivated behind their own closed doors. The absence of Charles Rogers from the subsequent decades of history is a masterclass in the art of disappearance. In an age before the digital panopticon, he understood that the most effective way to evade notice was to simply stop being noticeable. He stripped away the threads of his identity, the work history, the social connections, the financial obligations, until he was no longer a person to be found, but a void to be filled by speculation. The efforts of investigators, as extensive and persistent as they were, could never overcome the fact that he was essentially operating on a plane of existence that they could not reach. He was not a fugitive fleeing the scene in a panic. He was a phantom who had planned his exit from the very beginning. This level of foresight, this cold, clinical application of the same intelligence that once allowed him to map the Earth's crust, is what elevates the case from a mere homicide to an existential crisis for those tasked with maintaining order. In the final, reflective analysis, we must consider the perspective of the investigators who, day after day, year after year, stared at the photographs of that kitchen. They knew the floor plans of the house better than their own. They understood the internal dynamic of the family as if they had lived there themselves, and yet they remained completely, maddeningly ignorant of the perpetrator's fate. They were the keepers of a truth that had no resolution. To carry the weight of such an investigation is a unique, heavy burden, one that speaks to the dedication of those who believe that even when justice is impossible, the truth must be sought. Yet, in this case, the truth remains a ghost, shifting and elusive, forever retreating into the shadows of the past. The frustration of the investigators is a shared frustration for all who study the case, a feeling of coming so close to understanding the architecture of a nightmare, only to be left standing outside the door, staring at a space that has been emptied of its most important occupant. Perhaps the most significant and most painful takeaway from the icebox murders is the realization of the fragility of the social contract. We assume that our lives are protected by the implicit understanding that we live in a world where actions have consequences and where the truth, given enough time and effort, will emerge into the light. The Rogers case proves that this assumption is not always grounded in reality. There are acts so profoundly disruptive, so meticulously executed, and so expertly concealed that they exist entirely outside the framework of human accountability. The perpetrator in this case successfully defied the legal, social, and moral expectations of his time, and in doing so, he forced us to stare into the abyss and accept that there are some shadows that no amount of light will ever illuminate. The legacy of this story will likely continue to evolve as new generations encounter the details of the icebox murders, each one bringing their own perspectives, their own anxieties, and their own efforts to impose order on a narrative that is fundamentally chaotic. It will continue to be a staple of true crime lore, a centerpiece in the discussions of those who are drawn to the darker, more inexplicable elements of the human experience. But no matter how many books are written, how many podcasts are produced, or how many theories are debated in the forums of the internet, the core of the mystery will remain untouched. The kitchen on Driscoll Street, the neatly packaged remains, the bleach-scrubbed bathroom, these are the frozen, permanent images of an event that has achieved a kind of horrific, untouchable immortality. They represent a snapshot of a moment in time where the ordinary and the monstrous intersected with a precision that defies explanation, leaving us with a mystery that is as cold, as silent, and as enduring as the refrigerator that once held the darkest secret in the history of Houston. As the years continue to pass, the story will slowly drift from memory into myth, its edges blurred by the softening effects of time. The people involved, the victims, the suspect, the investigators, will eventually be nothing more than names on a document, their lives and their roles in this tragedy lost to the indifference of the passing decades. Yet, the essential question posed by the icebox murders will remain. How does a person reconcile the existence of such profound, calculated evil with the desire for a world that makes sense? We are left to navigate the space between the horror we know and the truth we will never possess. We are left with the silence, a silence that is not the absence of sound, but the presence of an answer that we are not meant to have. The case stands, as it always has, as a chilling, singular reminder of the void that exists within the fabric of our lives, a void that was filled for one brief, terrible moment in 1965 and has remained empty ever since, inviting us to look, to wonder, and ultimately, to accept the profound, disturbing reality that some questions will remain unanswered for the rest of human time. This is the final, inescapable truth of the icebox murders. They are not a story with an ending, but a state of being, an open, aching wound in the history of our shared human experience that will never fully heal, never fully close, and never, ever allow us the quiet comfort of believing we have seen the full, ugly face of the world. The finality of the icebox murders is not found in a gavel strike or a prison sentence, but in the enduring silence that has come to define the aftermath of 1965. As we stand at the distance of many decades, the narrative of the Rogers family has transitioned from a breaking news story into a permanent fixture of urban mythology, a tale whispered in the corridors of police departments and analyzed in the dark corners of the internet. Yet, despite the endless scrutiny, the core of the event remains encased in a protective layer of unknowability. The perpetrator, Charles Rogers, succeeded in his ultimate mission. He achieved a state of absolute detachment, not just from his home, but from the very possibility of being defined by his actions. By vanishing into the ether, he forced the world to contend with the fact that evil can be both hyper-efficient and entirely unanswerable. The investigation that lasted for years eventually dissolved because there was nothing left to anchor it to reality. The house was razed, the bodies were interred, and the man who orchestrated the horror simply ceased to be a part of the human story. This total erasure is perhaps the most uncomfortable facet of the entire case. We are accustomed to narratives where the antagonist is eventually confronted, where the truth is brought to light, and where the moral balance of the world is restored. We seek comfort in the idea that there is a tether connecting the perpetrator to their deeds. But Charles Rogers effectively cut that tether. He did not leave behind a confession, a diary, or a trail of errors that might have allowed for a humanized understanding of his descent into violence. He left behind only the cold, sterile efficiency of his work. This lack of a narrative voice from the suspect forces us to project our own interpretations onto the event, turning the icebox murders into a mirror that reflects our own anxieties about identity, isolation, and the terrifying potential for a human being to exist entirely on their own terms, devoid of the social constraints that typically bind us to one another. The lack of a culprit to confront ensures that the wound remains open, pulsating with the same uncertainty that plagued the investigators who first stepped into that kitchen on Driscoll Street. The legacy of this case also forces us to grapple with the disturbing reality of the perfect crime. In the popular imagination, the perfect crime is usually a glamorous, high-stakes endeavor, but the reality of the icebox murders is far more chilling. It was a domestic affair, a matter of family, that was handled with the same cold, analytical detachment one might apply to a lab experiment. The cleanup was not a frantic act of concealment. It was a demonstration of a profound, sociopathic level of control. The fact that the bathroom was scrubbed to a standard that exceeded the capabilities of local forensics is a reminder that when someone is motivated by a lifetime of perceived grievance and possesses the technical intellect to execute their plan, they are capable of operating beyond the reach of standard law enforcement. It suggests that our forensic capabilities, while impressive, are still lagging behind the capacity of a truly disciplined, intelligent mind to erase the physical evidence of their existence. This vulnerability is what makes the case so persistent, even as the specific details of the time and place begin to fade. Moreover, the story of the Rogers family stands as a dark warning about the dangers of the modern home. The mid-60s suburban dream was built on the foundation of privacy, a concept that was intended to be the bedrock of a stable society. However, privacy can also be a cloak for the most heinous acts. When the doors are closed and the neighbors are conditioned to respect the silence, the home becomes a sanctuary for whatever secrets are nurtured within. The Rogers family lived behind a facade of normalcy that successfully masked a multi-generational crisis of abuse, betrayal, and eventually, total destruction. The fact that no one suspected the depths of the dysfunction within those walls until it was far too late is a testament to the power of that societal agreement of privacy. It reminds us that our obsession with maintaining the sanctity of the home can, in certain circumstances, effectively guarantee that the worst imaginable things can occur without interruption. In reflecting on the disappearance of Charles, we must also consider the psychological profile of a man who could sustain such an existence. He was a creature of absolute compartments. He managed to separate his professional life from his domestic life, his intellect from his trauma, and eventually, his reality from his consequences. This compartmentalization is a defense mechanism taken to the absolute extreme. It is a way of navigating the world that denies the interconnectedness of our actions, allowing an individual to perform acts of utter devastation while simultaneously maintaining the appearance of a functioning, capable adult. The case of Charles Rogers is, at its heart, a study of what happens when a mind decides that it no longer needs the feedback of the world to define its reality. It is a terrifying glimpse into the interior life of a man who had effectively decided to inhabit a world of his own creation, one where the rules of empathy and accountability had been permanently overwritten by the cold, binary logic of survival and retribution. The passage of time has only served to sharpen the outlines of this mystery, rather than soften them. We no longer look at the case as a matter of finding a culprit. We look at it as a matter of contemplating a ghost. The figure of Charles Rogers has become, in the minds of those who study the case, a symbol of the ultimate fugitive, someone who not only escaped the police, but escaped the entire narrative of their life. His disappearance has become the central, unsolvable puzzle of the incident. It invites us to wonder if he is living out his days in a quiet, obscure corner of the world, having successfully shed his skin and adopted a new persona, or if he is a cautionary tale of a life ended in isolation and obscurity, his name lost to the records of time. This uncertainty is not a flaw in the story. It is its essential, haunting quality. The lack of an ending is, in itself, the ending we are forced to accept. We must also recognize the profound, lingering impact of the Icebox murders on the city of Houston itself. The event became a part of the city's folklore, a dark, defining moment that challenged its image as a place of stability and suburban progress. It served as a grim anchor for the city's history, a constant reminder of the potential for chaos that hides beneath the surface of even the most ordered existence. The demolition of the house on Driscoll Street was not enough to sweep away the memory. Instead, it solidified it, turning the site into a metaphorical place where the past continues to loom over the present. The city has moved on, grown, and transformed, yet the story of the Rogers family remains a persistent, uncomfortable thread in its collective memory, a thread that refuses to be cut. Ultimately, the Icebox murders serve as a profound and deeply unsettling reminder that the most significant events in our lives are not always the ones that are marked by public attention or resolution. They are the ones that leave us with questions we cannot answer, spaces we cannot fill, and stories that refuse to be closed. We seek to understand the world by imposing narratives upon it, by turning events into chapters that lead to a conclusion, but this case defies that instinct. It is a narrative that breaks, leaving us with fragments that do not connect. It forces us to accept that there are some shadows that we will never be able to light, and that in the grand scheme of our shared human experience, there are truths that are meant to remain hidden. We are left with a silence that is absolute, a silence that is final, and a silence that continues to resonate with the echo of a nightmare that has no expiration date. The study of this case will never truly end, because it is not just a study of a crime, but a study of the void itself, a void that was opened in 1965 and has remained open ever since, daring us to look and see the reflection of our own human fragility and the terrifying reality that, sometimes, the truth is not out there waiting to be found, but is instead gone, lost to the dark and unreachable forever. The icebox murders are not a mystery to be solved. They are a mystery to be lived with, a permanent, chilling, and essential part of the story of what it means to be human in a world that is not always designed to make sense. It is a testament to the power of the secret, the strength of the silence, and the frightening, absolute reality of the disappearing man who left behind a legacy that will never, ever be finished. The final contemplation of the icebox murders necessitates a departure from the forensic and procedural analysis that has dominated the investigation, leading us into the deeper, more philosophical territory of human nature itself. As we move past the chronological markers of 1965, the 1970s, and the subsequent decades that have smoothed the sharp edges of the tragedy into the texture of history, we find ourselves grappling with an unsettling conclusion. The story of Fred, Edwina, and Charles Rogers is fundamentally a story of how the human mind can construct, maintain, and eventually destroy its own reality. When we speak of the icebox murders, we are not merely discussing a series of actions that occurred within a kitchen. We are discussing the manifestation of a psychological state that had become so disconnected from the shared reality of the outside world that it effectively existed in a vacuum. The house on Driscoll Street was not a home in any traditional sense. It was a carefully curated, self-sustaining theater of misery, where the roles of parent and child were so distorted by betrayal and resentment that the ultimate outcome became, in the dark logic of that house, almost inevitable. To understand the endurance of this case, one must look at the silence that followed the crime. The vacuum of information that Charles Rogers created by his disappearance is the source of the case's immense power. We have an inherent, almost desperate need to fill that vacuum with narrative, to craft a beginning, a middle, and an end that provides us with the sense of order we crave. We want to believe that Charles was caught, that he faced the consequences, or at the very least, that he suffered in some way that balanced the scales of justice. But the truth is that he left behind no such evidence. He stripped away the very things that would have allowed us to understand him, his correspondence, his personal effects, his social trail, and in doing so, he maintained his power over the narrative long after he had left the scene. He remains, for those who study the case, a mirror that reflects only our own uncertainty. The silence he left behind is not empty. It is heavy with the questions we are not meant to answer, a testament to the fact that some people are capable of navigating the world in a way that is entirely invisible to the rest of us. The physical act of dismemberment, as analyzed in the previous segments, remains the most difficult aspect of the case to reconcile with our understanding of human behavior. It represents the point at which the perpetrator shifted from a human agent driven by anger to a mechanical agent driven by the necessity of total erasure. This shift is the truly terrifying part of the icebox murders. It suggests that, under the right, or rather the wrong circumstances, a person can dissociate so completely from their own actions that they treat the bodies of their parents with the same clinical, detached precision as one would treat an unwanted, inanimate object. This kind of cold, methodical violence is an affront to our most basic moral structures, and it is this violation that keeps the case alive in the public imagination. We are repulsed by it, yes, but we are also fascinated by the sheer capability required to pull it off. It represents a level of psychological control that is both impressive in its technical execution and horrifying in its moral emptiness. When we consider the legal resolution of the case, we see the limitations of our social institutions. The court's declaration of death in absentia was a rational, pragmatic act, an attempt to bring order to an inherently chaotic situation. But it was also a failure. It was the moment the system effectively surrendered to the ghost of Charles Rogers. By declaring him dead, the law stopped looking for him, and in that cessation of effort, the perpetrator achieved his ultimate victory. He did not need to be physically present to escape the reach of the law. He only needed to be beyond the reach of its knowledge. This realization is profoundly unsettling because it exposes the weakness of our structures in the face of an adversary who refuses to play by the rules of society. The law is designed to deal with people who are part of the system, not people who have effectively stepped out of it, and the icebox murders serve as a case study for what happens when that system is challenged by a phantom. As we look toward the future, the study of this case will undoubtedly continue, but it will do so with the understanding that we have reached the limit of what can be known. The archival material is finite. The people who experienced the event are fading. The evidence is, for all intents and purposes, exhausted. What remains is the legend, the story of the man who turned his home into a tomb, scrubbed the stains from the tiles, packed his family into the cold darkness of a refrigerator, and then simply walked out into the Texas heat, never to be seen again. This story will always be more than a crime report. It will always be a meditation on the darkness that can take root in the heart of a home and the terrifying silence that remains long after the violence is finished. It is a story that requires no further evidence to be chilling and no further investigation to be complete. It is and will always be a finished masterpiece of human darkness, a quiet, cold, and enduring monument to the potential for total disconnection. We must also reflect on the broader impact of such a case on our understanding of community. In a neighborhood like the one in Houston, people were living their lives, believing that the house next door was just another home, not realizing that a slow, methodical extermination of an entire family was taking place behind the thin walls of the residence. This sense of security, the idea that we can know our neighbors and trust in the safety of our environments, is a fragile thing. The icebox murders remind us that privacy is a double-edged sword, one that provides us with the freedom to live our lives but also provides the predator with the shelter to operate in complete obscurity. The silence of the neighborhood, the fact that no one reported anything unusual until the stench of reality could no longer be ignored, is a part of the tragedy. It highlights the distance that exists between us, even when we live in such proximity, and it challenges us to consider whether we are as connected to our communities as we believe ourselves to be. The legacy of the Rogers family is that they have become part of a history that no one wanted to inherit. The city of Houston, in its development and its growth, has moved on from the event, but the memory of the crime remains, a subterranean pulse that reminds us that the history of any place is composed of both the bright, visible achievements and the dark, hidden secrets that are buried under the concrete. The story is a necessary one, not because it provides us with lessons or solutions, but because it provides us with the reality of what humans are capable of. It is an honest, if horrific, account of the fragility of the social contract and the thinness of the barrier that separates our lives from the abyss. We look back at it not to solve the mystery, for we know it is insoluble, but to acknowledge it, to recognize that these things happen, and to understand that our desire for meaning is often thwarted by the brutal, meaningless nature of reality. In the end, the case of the icebox murders is a story about the absolute power of the secret. Charles Rogers kept a secret, and in doing so, he became the architect of a legend that has outlived him, outlived the house, and outlived the initial fury of the police investigation. He ensured that he would never be defined by the justice system, but by the mystery that he himself created. This is his final, cold legacy, a vacuum that we are forever trying to fill, a silence that we are forever trying to break, and a mystery that will remain, as it has always been, firmly beyond our grasp. The story of the icebox murders is not a story of the past, but a story of the present, a permanent feature of our psychological landscape, a reminder of the shadows that we all carry, and the terrifying potential for a human being to become something else, something hidden, something gone, and something that will never, ever be truly understood. The case is, and remains, the ultimate unanswered question, a perfect, chilling, and silent monument to the dark, untouchable, and forever mysterious nature of the disappearing man. The culmination of our journey into the dark history of 1815 Driscoll Street brings us to a final, uncomfortable realization. The true legacy of the icebox murders is the surrender of our demand for absolute clarity. As we close this narrative, we are forced to reconcile with the fact that the most enduring stories are often those that refuse to provide a resolution. The life, the crimes, and the eventual disappearance of Charles Rogers have become a permanent, haunting fixture in the architecture of American true crime, not because of what we know, but because of the vast, impenetrable silence that surrounds what we do not. This silence is not merely an absence of facts. It is a weight, a heavy, suffocating presence that forces every researcher, every investigator, and every reader to look at the void and acknowledge its absolute power. In the decades since that June in 1965, the investigation has shifted from a search for a man to a study of a phenomenon. We have learned that when a human being chooses to systematically dismantle their own existence, to strip away the ties that bind them to society, and to operate with the cold, clinical precision of a surgeon, they can effectively step out of the light of justice and into a place where the law cannot follow. The case of the Icebox murders is a testament to the fact that justice, in the way we conceive of it, as a balancing of accounts, as a public confrontation of the perpetrator, is not a universal constant. It is a fragile system, one that relies entirely on the perpetrator's participation in the social contract. When that contract is unilaterally shredded, as it was on that Father's Day in Houston, the system becomes effectively powerless. The psychological footprint of Charles Rogers remains the most compelling, yet elusive, aspect of this legacy. He was not a creature of disorganized impulses, nor was he driven by the chaotic, frenzied needs that characterize so many other high-profile criminals. He was, by every indication, a man who functioned with a terrifying level of internal order. His intelligence, his technical skills, and his capacity for deep, sustained focus were not merely professional assets. They were the very tools he utilized to orchestrate the most profound, intimate violation imaginable. This makes him a figure of immense, albeit grotesque, fascination. We are forced to consider the chilling reality that brilliance does not preclude darkness, and that a high-functioning intellect can be used to construct a prison of one's own design, one where the rules of empathy and human connection are permanently suspended. The way he lived, the notes under the door, the absolute silence between family members, was not just a symptom of his toxicity. It was a deliberate, controlled environment, a precursor to the final, fatal act that would remove his parents from the world. We look at this history and wonder how many other people might be living in similarly compartmentalized realities, harboring thoughts and plans that are hidden behind the mundane, everyday facades they present to the world. As we move forward, the story of the Icebox murders will continue to serve as a beacon for those who are drawn to the unexplained. It will be referenced in textbooks, debated in the halls of criminal justice, and remembered in the lore of Houston. Yet it will always stand apart, a singular, jagged, and untouchable piece of history. The destruction of the house on Driscoll Street, while physically removing the stage of the crime, failed to excise the memory of what happened there. That memory has become detached from the physical reality of the neighborhood, taking on a life of its own, transforming into something that exists in the minds of anyone who has ever heard the story. It is a cautionary tale, yes, but it is also a reminder of the limits of our knowledge. We have pushed this investigation to its boundaries, we have explored every theory, and we have scrutinized every shred of evidence, only to arrive back at the same conclusion. We do not know where Charles Rogers went. We do not know if he found peace, and we will never know if he felt the weight of his actions in the years that followed. This uncertainty is not a failing of the research. It is the fundamental truth of the case. The tragedy of the Rogers family is that their lives were essentially redefined by the final, violent moments of their existence. Fred and Edwina are no longer just people, they are the victims of the most horrific act of dismemberment in local history. Their story is now permanently tied to the refrigerator in their kitchen, a detail that is as indelible as it is gruesome. It is a cruel, final irony that their final resting place was a site of everyday domestic utility. The way they were discovered, the neatly wrapped remains, the calculated organization, shows that even in death, they were subject to the cold, mechanical control of their son. This total loss of dignity, this transformation from a human life into a managed clinical task, is what resonates so deeply with the public. It is a profound, visceral violation that strikes at our deepest fears about death and the loss of our individual essence. The Icebox murders were, in essence, the ultimate erasure, a process of taking two human beings and, through a process of systematic labor, reducing them to nothing more than a logistical problem to be disposed of. Looking back, the lack of a court case remains the most significant, yet frustrating, element of the entire saga. We're left to wonder what would have happened if Charles had been brought to trial. What would he have said? What would have been revealed about the dynamic of that house, about the alleged abuses, about the internal world of a man who could do such a thing? These questions will remain forever hypothetical. The absence of a trial ensured that the internal life of Charles Rogers would never be exposed to the light of day. He escaped the crucible of the courtroom, and by doing so, he maintained his mystery. We are left only with the reports, the observations, and the gaps that they suggest, forcing us to build our own understandings of a man who ultimately remains a cipher. This is the enduring, frustrating nature of the case. It is a story that refuses to be completed, a story that demands that we accept the reality of the incomplete, the reality of the missing, and the reality of the forever unsolved. The legacy of this event also serves as a reflection of the society in which it occurred. In the mid-60s, the American domestic experience was undergoing a shift, a movement toward greater privacy and greater individualization. The Rogers house was an extreme, distorted reflection of this shift. It was a place where individual isolation reached its absolute limit, resulting in a breakdown that had catastrophic consequences. This reminds us that we are inherently social beings, and that when we cut the ties that bind us to one another, we risk the loss of our humanity. The silence that governed the household was a precursor to the violence. It was the manifestation of a total, irredeemable disconnection. The lesson, if there is one to be found in such a dark, chaotic event, is that connection is not just a convenience, it is a requirement. When we lose that, when we retreat into the shadows of our own constructed realities, we lose the thing that keeps us anchored to the world, and we become vulnerable to the darkness that lurks within our own minds. As we conclude this long examination of the Icebox murders, we must return to the silence. It is the beginning, the middle, and the end of the story. It is the silence of the notes slipped under the door, the silence of the neighborhood as the crime was being committed, the silence of the perpetrator as he walked away, and the silence of the decades that have followed. This silence is the true, final answer to the mystery. It is a silence that refuses to be broken, a silence that holds the secrets of the Driscoll Street house with an iron, unyielding grip. We are left only with our own reflections, with the questions we have raised, and the gaps we have identified. The story does not end because we have exhausted the subject. It ends because the story itself has no more to give. It is a closed, dark, and forever mysterious chapter that stands as a silent sentinel in the annals of true crime, a reminder that in the face of the ultimate secret, we have no choice but to acknowledge our limitations and accept the silence as our only and final companion in the dark. The Icebox murders are not a mystery to be solved. They are a mystery to be lived with, a permanent, chilling, and essential part of the story of what it means to be human in a world that is not always designed to make sense, a world that is full of shadows that we will never reach, and secrets that we will never hear. The case is finished, but the echo remains, a steady, rhythmic pulse in the history of our shared human experience, a pulse that will continue to beat long after the last person who remembers the event has finally, silently faded away into the night. We look one last time at the void, and we see not just the darkness, but the reflection of our own human fragility, our own desire to know, and our own final, quiet acceptance that there are some things in this world that are truly, deeply, and forever beyond our understanding. The exploration of the Icebox murders, spanning 11 distinct examinations of its chilling architecture, has brought us to a profound impasse where the mechanics of the crime and the mythology of the culprit finally merge into a single, inescapable reality: the absolute permanence of the unknown. We have dissected the domestic atmosphere of the Driscoll Street house, analyzed the cold, clinical efficiency of the dismemberment, and scrutinized the legal failures that allowed Charles Rogers to drift into the historical ether. Yet, to step back and survey the totality of this investigation is to recognize that we have not merely been analyzing a crime. We have been participating in the construction of an enduring enigma. The case serves as an ultimate laboratory for the human obsession with closure, a persistent, uncomfortable reminder that the desire to understand is not synonymous with the ability to know. As we reach this terminal point in our narrative, we find that the void left by Charles Rogers has not been filled, but rather crystallized, becoming an essential, immutable feature of the American true crime landscape. The legacy of the Icebox murders is, fundamentally, a legacy of absence. It is the absence of a trial, the absence of a motive articulated by the perpetrator, and the absence of a confirmed fate for the man who orchestrated the horror. In a culture that relentlessly demands explanations, that insists upon the neat alignment of cause and effect, motive and retribution, this case stands as an affront. It is a jagged, broken piece of reality that resists every attempt at smooth integration into our collective understanding. The brilliance of Charles Rogers, his capacity to map the complexities of the Earth and navigate the mechanics of a military aircraft, is the very thing that ensured his transition from a physical person into an abstraction. He did not simply run away. He dismantled his entire identity with the same patient, surgical focus he applied to the remains of his parents. He ensured that the only thing remaining for us to study would be the structure of his crime, leaving his inner self, his intentions, and his destination entirely inaccessible. This accessibility is a recurring theme in the examination of the most profound criminal mysteries. We are accustomed to the narrative of the hunt, where the hunter, the investigator, the detective, the inquisitive public, eventually gains the upper hand. We believe in the inevitability of the light, revealing the darkness. But the Icebox murders subvert this expectation entirely. They demonstrate that an adversary of sufficient intelligence and sufficient detachment can, if they are willing to surrender every vestige of their former life, successfully defy the combined reach of the state, the public, and the passage of time. This is not a failure of investigation. It is a feature of the human condition. It reminds us that there are spaces in our world, hidden corners, alternate lives, and untraced paths that exist entirely beyond our reach. We have explored every theory regarding the fate of Charles Rogers, from his potential death in Central America to his quiet, anonymous survival in the shadows, and every theory remains exactly that, a speculation, a story we tell to fill the silence. The house itself, that modest structure on Driscoll Street, has evolved in our collective memory from a physical location into a symbol. It represents the ultimate danger of the domestic interior, the possibility that the place we deem most secure can, with the correct, tragic ingredients of dysfunction, transform into a slaughterhouse. The silence of the neighborhood, the fact that no one saw or heard the process of the murders, is a testament to the isolating power of the modern home. We are reminded that, for all our connectivity, we often exist in profound, terrifying proximity to lives that are completely opaque to us. The neighbors who mowed their lawns while the crime was occurring, the nephew who eventually made the call to the police, they are all characters in a tragedy where the true antagonist remained unseen, unheard, and ultimately unconfronted. This realization is what gives the story its persistent, chilling resonance. It is a story not just about what happened, but about what could happen right next door, entirely unnoticed, until the horrifying evidence is forced upon our consciousness. Furthermore, we must confront the reality of the forensic erasure. The fact that the bathroom was scrubbed so thoroughly that not a single trace of blood remained to speak of the violence is a stark, brutal indicator of the perpetrator's state of mind. It was not a cleanup, it was a crusade. It was a rejection of the physical reality of the act, an attempt to cleanse the environment of the horror he had brought into being. This level of dedication to erasure speaks to a deep, internal conflict, a desire to kill the architects of his misery while simultaneously wanting to purge their existence from the fabric of his reality. The icebox, the cold, metallic heart of the kitchen, became the final destination for the physical remnants, a place where they could be contained, hidden, and ultimately forgotten. The perpetrator's success in this regard is what ensures that the case remains a subject of study, for he left us with a puzzle that is as logically perfect as it is morally repugnant. As we look back at the 11 segments of our analysis, we see the arc of a tragedy that has successfully resisted every effort to ground it in standard moral narrative. We have used the terminology of crime, of law, of psychology, and of history, and yet, the core of the event remains untouched. The icebox murders are not a mystery to be solved because they have already achieved a kind of horrific, untouchable completion. The perpetrator achieved his goal. He exited the narrative on his own terms. He left us with the questions, he left us with the photographs of the refrigerator, and he left us with the silence. This is the ultimate, final power of the criminal, to leave the world with a mystery that it can never resolve. We are left only with the echo, a steady, rhythmic, and persistent pulse that reminds us of the fragility of our own understanding. The impact of this case on the field of criminal justice is equally significant. It serves as a permanent reference point for what happens when the system fails to account for the truly anomalous actor. It challenges the methodologies of investigation, the assumptions of motive, and the expectations of resolution. The detectives who lived with the case, who studied the files until the words and the images became part of their own memories, were forced to accept the limits of their professional agency. Their story is also part of the mystery, the story of the human effort to bring light to the dark and the frustration that occurs when that light is not enough to reveal the truth. They are the silent witnesses to the case's unsolvable nature, the guardians of a file that has no final answer. Their dedication is a tribute to the necessity of the search, even when the goal of that search is proven to be impossible. In the final, reflective light, the icebox murders demand that we recognize our own fragility. We want to believe that the world is a place of order, where every question has an answer and every crime has a conclusion. But this event reminds us that we live in a world that is fundamentally unpredictable, a world that can be shattered in an instant, and a world where the most profound secrets can be taken into the grave or into a new life, leaving the rest of us to stare into the abyss of our own unknowing. The story does not end because we have no more to say. It ends because the silence has reasserted its dominance. It is a silence that has persisted since 1965, and it is a silence that will persist long after we have ceased to wonder about the fate of Charles Rogers. It is the final, inescapable truth of the icebox murders. They are not a crime to be solved, but a reality to be acknowledged. We look one last time at the void. We acknowledge the absence of the man, the absence of the house, and the presence of the mystery, and we accept, with a quiet, lingering discomfort, that some things in this life are meant to remain lost, forever held in the cold, dark, and silent embrace of the past. The case is, and remains, the ultimate unanswered question, a perfect, chilling, and silent monument to the dark, untouchable, and forever mysterious nature of the disappearing man, and we are left with nothing but the echo, a steady, rhythmic pulse in the history of our shared human experience, a pulse that will continue to beat long after the last person who remembers the event has finally, silently faded away into the night, leaving us with the only conclusion that is truly ours. The realization that the mystery itself is the legacy, and that we are all, in the end, observers of a darkness that we will never truly fathom or ever truly escape.